Welcome. Hello. My name is Jen Mercer-Doms. I'm the Vice President of U.S. Development with Mayshad Choice. We are an ecosystem of brands for women by women, championing women professionally and personally as we connect them to each other and to the companies, causes, and organizations that support and champion equity for women in the workplace and beyond. We host every Thursday, welcome, our Women in Money series, where we host incredibly accomplished women and the men that support women in the workplace as well, for lively, entertaining, and informative conversations around all things related to our relationship with money. Today, we have a very special guest with us, Susan Ganz, and I'll introduce her in a second. And please make sure to stay tuned to all of our updated programming and content and how you too can get involved with Mayshad. Join us at joinmayshad.com to learn more about our membership and all of our upcoming programming. And please make sure to type in your questions in the comments bar and we'll get to as many as possible. Today we have Susan Ganz. Hi, Susan, welcome.
Hi, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here today.
Oh, great. And I'm so happy to have this conversation because you have such an interesting blend of background from finance and IT, and you went to college for clinical psychology. So this would be a really interesting conversation around the impact of how we think about money, particularly right now, as we know that our world is changing on a daily basis. And Susan, you and I met when you were the president of the Financial Women's Association many years ago. Yes. Hi. So I'll read your bio and then we'll dive deep into the conversation.
Awesome.
Susan is a business strategist with Ganz Business Solutions, working with senior level executives on their organization's key strategy and change management initiatives to improve productivity and profitability. Susan is the host of the web show REST, which stands for Resiliency and Empowerment Seminar Today, where she highlights the journeys of leaders of businesses and nonprofit organizations. Before launching her own company, she advised clients at Prudential and headed strategy and communications at Credit Suisse and was a VP at Merrill Lynch in global technology and services. And of course, as we know now, she's the past president of the Financial Women's Association. Today, our conversation revolves around the power of one's network to help us think through how we want to create wealth for ourselves, for our communities, and for our own ecosystems now here as we're all struggling and adopting and changing in the world of COVID-19, and how we move forward creating financial independence for ourselves as well. Susan, it's interesting in the early conversations you and I had planning for this session today around the stories that we tell ourselves about money. And when we think through from early days of childhood to now how we perceive and interact and include money as a large part of our identity, some of the stories we often tell ourselves are things like money doesn't grow on trees, or we don't talk about money. Like how many times have we as women have said, oh, we just don't talk about money, right? Or what do you think, I'm made of money? Or even Keeping Up with the Joneses implies this natural analysis and comparison of what you have in terms of accumulation of stuff, which of course is about money, to the neighbors, to someone else. So we're often comparing ourselves to others. Where did that come from? And as I read all those phrases, I think, wow, this sounds really negative. But yet we're also in some levels driven by money. Talk to us about where that originated and how that came to be.
So I think that these notions of money came out of society and messages that we might have heard throughout our childhood and into adult life. But when you look at what money really is, it's simply a system of exchange. It's our beliefs that sometimes can get in the way of really what money is all about and what we're all about. And you and I had talked about that our self-worth is not equal to our net worth. So I think that's so powerful. As a mentor of mine was the one who turned me on to that phrase. And once I really understood that, it was so freeing and so empowering that we do have a lot of power and good qualities that don't have to do with this one form of currency called money.
It's interesting because as we think about, the principles on which this country was founded, individual freedoms, right? The freedom to free speech, the freedom of assembly, the freedom to own property. Those are very much grounded in individual rights, as opposed to other countries that have much more of a collective and much more of a communicative sense of, just how they approach their cultures. It's interesting that today in the New York Times, there's actually an article that is going to segue really nicely into our conversation. They predicted the crisis of 2020 in 1991. So how does this all end? And it was written by two scholars, Neil Howe and Bill Strauss. Bill has since died, but those two gentlemen together actually coined the term millennials. So if we're all wondering how that came to be, it was, these two guys actually, coined the term millennials, who wrote the book Generations, oddly enough, and introduced the theory that American history unfolds in boom to bust cycles lasting approximately 80 years each. And they talk about the way that each generation develops its own characteristics and leadership qualities that influence our political spheres, influence us socially, economically, and just really impact how we approach everything professionally and personally. And Neil now points to the fact that Gen Xers and baby boomers championed individualism much more so than prioritizing community. And, as we think through now our individual identities and how so much of our identities, Susan, going back to your points, are really tied up into this notion of, self-worth. In this moment in time now that we're experiencing this, and COVID-19, as we know, has rocked every aspect of our lives, do you think that us Xers and baby boomers will think differently about our individual approach to money and how that's shaped our identity, particularly now because we're also honestly, buying less, spending less, thinking about savings and retirement and our legacy in such different ways?
So I think now is a time of reflection and people really evaluating what's important to them in life and what are their core values, and starting to appreciate and be in gratitude for things that I think we've taken for granted, like relationships with family, relationships with friends, relationships with our broader communities, maybe reconnecting, in my personal case, with people from business school. This was supposed to be our reunion year, but we found ways remotely to connect. And I think there's such a human need now for that connection and community, whereas before maybe that was more towards the back of our minds instead of the front of our minds. So I think it's a great time to reevaluate what's important to us.
It's interesting. I'm wondering from your perspective, do you think this is how we had started when we thought about kind of the large economy around the sharing economy, for example? And instead of buying new things, we were often paying to share things, whether it was, lodging through Airbnb or office space at, a shared office space co-working company, or wearing each other's clothes through Rent Their Own Way. Do you think that trend had already started? And do we have millennials to thank for that? And being on the forefront of that movement, or were there larger things happening in the sense of, just how we perceive value and the value that we place on things, physical things?
I think there's a lot of forces that have been at work that's causing us to be in this time of thinking more collaboratively, to know that I think what this pandemic has done has made us aware that something that happens on the other side of the world is important because it affects us. And we saw we had to learn this lesson, perhaps the hard way, that we need to be more mindful of what's happening around us, the people, the places, and less on the physical things. And so I think now there's going to be new things, new creativity, creative ways that people can connect and do business. I think you and I talked about there's other currencies out there besides the money currency. A big currency that we have is our relationships on a professional level, on a personal level, and a community level. And you see lots of different communities coming together to support one another, to bring food to those who have some food insecurities, to bring food to first responders, to simply in the New York City area at 7:00 at night, just celebrating and coming together as communities like that. And you see those sparks of light, I'll call them, come through in various ways.
It's interesting because I think you're in a way talking about like how we're shifting our values, right? And where we place value and how we spend time, right? And so
Yes.
we talk often about and we'll talk a little bit in a bit about just kind of our strategy around money and how we can create different strategies, particularly now and going forward. But I often, like, I'm thinking right now of, like retail therapy, right? Like when, when we need to feel to have a release, whether it's, a fancy dinner out or, retail therapy under moments of stress, where you're buying those kind of those last minute purchases that normally would not be within your, your quote unquote budget, but you're doing that because there's a supposed sense of relief or gratitude or enjoyment that comes from making those impulse purchases. And now it seems like, what you're saying is that we're having to find those in different ways, in the sense of, valuing our time more and valuing others more. Talk to us a bit about that, like the shift in that approach.
Yes. As I said a few months ago, I think it's really a great time for reflection and figuring out what are our whys, what are important to us. And perhaps you had defined them before the pandemic. It's time to look at them and say, are they still meaningful to you at this point in time? Do they have staying power? And then from there, it's around your habits and your strategy. Are you making spending decisions, for example, that are in service to those whys? So for me, my whys are about family, about impact, and community. So if I'm buying a dress, for example, I'm thinking about, okay, how does that serve in making an impact, making me look good, for example, in a professional setting, and then I could also dress it down for a fun occasion when I'm connecting with community or family, as an example. Sometimes we let our emotions drive the purchase, and that's where the coffee habits come, and that's where the shopping habits come. And I've looked at people's spending patterns where people say, I don't understand where my money is going. And then we have a reflection on where the monies are going. No judgments, but just as information. And then when that becomes more conscious and they say, oh, I've been spending all that money on coffee drinks, or I see this pattern of where I've spent a lot of money one day because I was feeling bad. And I think once we decouple the goals from decouple, wanting to feel good through spending money, and that's where the change is going to come, and reminding people to be conscious of what are my values and what am I doing? Does this really serve me, or is it just in a moment of being emotional?
I really appreciate what you just said, particularly around that, is this of service to me? Because I think that, in the past, and you come from wealth management, right? And so I think it's fascinating to hear you say this because, from a wealth management perspective, it's about, building your portfolio and diversifying it and accumulating assets and, showing, those, the client service reports you get at the end of each month, like how much have I made, right? Like how much I've made in the stock market and, am I up or am I down? And that's very transactional, right? It's very much tied to data. It's very heavy heavy quant. It's but it's not really reflective of truly what is of service to us and what we deem to be a priority. And I'm also wondering, now, I keep thinking back on one thing you said earlier in our conversation, that you try to stay away from the word budget.
Yes.
Talk to us about that, because I think this segues really nicely into your philosophy around budgeting versus the larger strategy that one might want to think about employing during this moment in time.
Yes. So once you've defined what your whys are, and you look at where your money's coming in and where your money's going out, some people call that a budget. I tend to not call that a budget because people have such a negative connotation to it. They feel judged. So I love to take judgment out of the equation. It's much more freeing. So I look at it as a financial freedom worksheet or spreadsheet or whatever template you want to call it. And it's really about having information. It's purely information, because with information, that knowledge is then power, and that puts you in a position to make better decisions. So I think it's taking the emotion out of what you're spending your money on, your time on, and so forth, that it's really for you. It's about, are you bringing in the income in service of your goals? Is what you're doing to produce income aligned with your values? Or how you're spending your money, is it in service to those bigger things that are important to you? And I think it becomes a different energy when you approach it from that standpoint.
It's almost like it's an entirely different mental capacity, almost, yes. Right? Because when you think about, typically, a financial advisor, for example, or a wealth manager would talk about your long-term goals in the sense of, what do you need to have to retire comfortably? What is that number, right? Or if you're buying a house for the first time, second time, third time, how much is it going to cost, and how much do you need for the down payment, and how do you get to that point, right? Because that's also often the stumbling block is actually the down payment. Or if you're, going through a major life transition, a divorce, for example, which, the majority of our audience are female executives, entrepreneurs, and business owners. And, there's a running joke that is surfacing on all the social media channels now, that either this pandemic is going to result in a lot of babies being born or a lot of divorces. So I think the jury's still on the data around that, but it's also, planning for those unexpected moments. Many of us in, the Mayshad ecosystem have either, directly known of someone who's been affected and suffered horrendously with COVID, or have had family members or friends or coworkers or acquaintances die from it. And so those are major, there are major life changes that are happening in this moment in time, that there is the stress of money, right? Because as we know now, as of today, there were, 1 in 4 Americans have actually filed for unemployment claims, right? And so I'm wondering, Susan, from your perspective, there's all the stressors around money right now, but yet you and I are having a conversation around, having a different philosophy around the psychology of how we think about money. How do you reconcile those two, particularly right now when so many of us are focused on, either being furloughed or laid off, or, really suffering the economic consequences of the pandemic?
Yes. So I think it goes back to basic human needs. So if I borrow something from my psychology days of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right, it starts, the bottom 2 layers are physiological and safety. So we need to think about, okay, what are the bare bones, lack of better words to describe it. What is it that I really need right now, so that I can thrive with my family? What's going to keep a roof over my head, food on the table? Where can I potentially even barter for food with my talents? And how can I use community, my broader community? And I think for women, one of the things that's very hard is to admit that you need help. So I'm giving you permission right now to reach out for whatever it is, because without judgments, this is truly a global phenomenon, and we are interdependent upon one another. So if one person rises up, we all rise up. So don't keep the other person down, right? So it's really about figuring out what is it I need right now to move up on those needs so I could take care of my physiological and my safety needs, and then move from there. And there's so many resources that have surfaced. Look at your local chambers of commerce and your local communities. There are so many resources out there, and it's just so heartwarming to see how people are coming together. So that's how you reconcile it. There's still things that, yes, you need with the currency you call money, but some things maybe you can barter for, some things you might be able to use community resources for. And it's a time to get creative as well about, how could you be making money right now? I mean, there's a whole business that's popped up around lawn signs for people's birthdays and graduations and anniversaries. That's a whole new thing.
It's so interesting and so true. I feel like there have been really specific moments and times where the pandemic has really affected me in different ways. And I have very close friends who have had it, and know of close friends who have had family members who have died from it. And yet you still see those everyday moments of people trying to find joy in their lives, right? And, where, it's, if you have children, you know how expensive birthday parties can be and how much competitive stress there is, particularly for moms who feel they need to be very competitive in ensuring that, the party that they're throwing for the child, surpasses expectations, right? And so there's this whole sort of weird dynamic between, and understandably so, but this complicated dynamic between how we spend to impress others, right? And how we show up to impress others. But now there's this leveling of the playing field in the sense of, so neighbors of ours, we were driving by one day, and I had no idea what a drive-by celebration was yet. So this is early on in the pandemic, like literally at its height, right? When people were still really afraid just to leave their house. And we saw probably 10 cars like parked, and we're like, this seems very unsafe, right? But what we realized then was that they were celebrating one of their daughter's birthdays, and all of her friends were with their parents in each of their cars separately, like celebrating, right? And so you're right, there's really creative ways now that people are creating community and finding connectivity without having to spend a lot of money, right? And so I think that you're absolutely right in the sense of the way in which that relationship is shifting. And it's more now about just the moment in time to be grounded, take a pause, find joy in that moment, and really be present in that moment, where it really becomes about the moment and not about all the material things that often create the experience.
And it's about that Maya Angelou quote about, it's about how you make people feel. And so in this moment of not necessarily spending money to show how you make somebody feel, but just by being there, by listening, by saying, happy whatever celebration it is, it's just so special. And yesterday, for example, was my nephew's birthday, and we just recorded a quick video to say happy birthday. And when he woke up in the morning, he saw it, and it was something that, yes, that technology was there before, but now it was just something special to let him know that we're thinking about you, and I know we can't see you right now, but we hope to, be together again soon. So it's very creative times.
I'm wondering also, we experience now kind of the spectrum of coping and acceptance and grieving, and the 7 or 8 different signs of the grieving process, and many of us have gone through those individually and of course collectively. You also talk about a different kind of spectrum, the spectrum of financial wellness. Talk to us about that.
Yes, thank you for asking. So there are different stages that people are in their, what I call a financial wellness journey. So the spectrum starts with being unaware. So we're just not conscious. It's like brushing our teeth. We just kind of do it. And then we go from being unaware to being aware. So maybe we're starting to track what we're doing. We're asking questions about, what am I spending money, time on? And then there's moves into an intellectual understanding where you go a little bit deeper into what's going on with your finances and tying it to your goals. And then the sort of fourth area in the spectrum is about an emotional understanding of what's happening with your finances. So marrying the head space with the heart space. And then at the other end of the spectrum is where your way of operating around your finances just becomes part of who you are, your whole blueprint, your new operating system. And couples are even on different points in the journey. So it's about recognizing where are you, where is your partner in this, and having a dialogue around it, calling it out. It doesn't have to live in your head. You can talk to your partner about that. Talk to an outsider, meaning an advisor, a trusted person in your life that could give you some perspective.
It's interesting, Susan, what you're saying, because in large part, this is about communication, right? Communication
Yes.
with one's partner, communication with your closest friends, and, all the various ways in which you can actually reduce and eliminate kind of the notion of stigma around money, right?
Yes.
And when we think about why couples divorce, or why, either divorce or break up or separate or whatever the term is, money, as we know, is a very common driver of what tears people apart. So I'm wondering, particularly right now, because there is so much uncertainty in the economy, and we see so many ebbs and flows in the stock market, and we know that the stock market isn't necessarily tied to, individual living, right, on a day-to-day basis. What are some of your recommendations for, in particularly in those instances where communication is so hard, and it's so hard for so many different reasons, from the way that we're raised, and families that talk about money versus families that don't talk about money. There are gender differences, there are race and class differences. How, particularly in this moment in time, given the fact that we're all kind of under one roof with the people that we cohabitate with, how can we start to have those conversations differently? Like, what are some of the tactical tips that you talk about with your clients in the sense of just opening up the conversation?
Yes. So I'll talk about a process that I think people can use as a tool, if you will. I call it CPAS. So the C stands for clarity. So that is about getting very clear on what's important to you, what are your goals, what are your whys, because those become your guideposts in your decision making. And the P stands for permission, which especially is so important for women, is to put ourselves on our own agendas. And so if you're not able to do that yourself, you can blame Susan Ganz. You can say, Susan Ganz gave me permission to put myself on my agenda. And the A is for access, and that's about getting access to ideas and solutions by educating yourself with possibilities, by seeking out experts, seeking out resources through this type of community. The S is for security. So that's about making sure that your financial home, and we could get into that, is built on a solid foundation to support your goals. And then the final S is for support. So it's about developing your personal board of directors for all aspects of your life, your financial piece, your personal piece, your professional piece, so that you don't have to go it alone. And that's, I think, a big message to take away from today is you don't have to do it alone. And that's the value, one of the values of your community.
Let's talk about community for a second too. I feel like, this is a moment in time because, culturally, from a health perspective, from a political perspective, from a social perspective. Like the pandemic has really impacted all of us very, very, very materially, I guess you could say. And yet, based upon, what we've been talking about, we know that, women often perceive risk in different ways. We obviously perceive money in very different ways, and just how we talk about those topics within our own communities. I know, and I'm mentioning this because at Mayshad, like we really strive to take off our masks and really have honest conversations with our ecosystem. And honestly, what we're finding right now, there's this kind of this feeling of we're all kind of in it together, right? We're in it together. It's impacted every aspect of our lives. And so how can we use this moment in time to help support each other, Susan, to your point, in different ways, right? And I'm wondering, given your experience as the past president of the Women's Financial Association, which is a huge global organization, what did you learn about your time there serving at the president capacity that now you think would blend well with just how you connect with your own community and how women can support each other?
So I think that's a very interesting question. To get back to sort of we're all in this together, I think about it as, this is a great analogy I heard, and that's we're all in the same storm together, but we might be in a different boat approaching this storm. So that's something to be mindful of. Again, everybody's on different spectrum, not only with their money, but just how they're dealing with this particular crisis. And I think what I've learned from being a part of the Financial Women's Association and leading other groups is just in the power of letting the community create a space for honest dialogue. And when you, again, take the judgment out of the equation and being vulnerable and telling people and letting people know, like, I'm not perfect, you're not perfect. We're doing the best that we can. And that's why, it brings a smile to my face when I see television anchors have pets come wandering into their picture, or in the case of some of the late night hosts, having their children be part of the frame to say, this is real life. We're all having to manage and to juggle all the different aspects of our life, and that's real. And I think one of the things I also learned sort of through my involvement in the Financial Women's Association is I've learned to kind of align who I am. I used to think that I had to be three different people. So I had to be Susan the professional, Susan the community person, Susan the family person. And once I decided that I can be just one person and have these different aspects, and it's okay to talk about family and community in professional settings, that's where I saw just a shift in my own personal growth.
I really appreciate what you just said. And I think that for many women, look, like this 2020 year is going to be a period even more dramatic than the 2007, 2008 market collapse. I think from the perspective of, given the severity of how it's impacted just people's professions and careers and jobs, that I envision many more women starting businesses and starting, solopreneurship companies, or becoming entrepreneurs, or, really thinking through, what does this moment in time mean for me and how I want to develop my own worth, right? How do I want to leave my legacy, whatever that looks like at the individual level. And I also think that, it's, partly due to the fact of, look, like we're not all in person together, right? And so we may not be spending as much money on dry cleaning because we don't need to. We may not be doing our hair as much because we don't need to. Like we're literally, I can see, what's happening in your office. You can see what's happening in my living room right now. Like there's so much more of our own personalities that are ironically coming through in that digital space. And I'm wondering, Susan, do you think that this is going to further enable women who often feel like, for a lot of different sociological reasons, because, the women who paved the way for us had to be very competitive because there were so few spots open for women at that time in every industry, right? And so there was this sense of competitiveness that was what was bred into, you know, how we just survived in the corporate world. Now it's a very different moment in time, and I'm wondering if, you know, this moment in time is giving us the permission to say things just aren't okay, right? I can't be perfect all the time just because it's impossible to be perfect all the time, right? And I may not be able to spend money on looking perfect all the time because I just don't have that money to spend, right? And so is this going to be a way where, do you think companies then, because of this, will also learn how to value and appreciate women's contributions in different ways? And will that serve us as we, you know, hopefully see more women in management positions, or more women coming back into the workforce in more flexible ways, or more women on boards?
So I think that's a fabulous point, because we are having a window into each other's lives through this video medium. And I think that employers are now going to rethink what their policies are regarding working from home and being remote. And I think going forward, there's going to be a lot of hybrid working where there might be a smaller in-person footprint and a larger remote footprint, which will provide other opportunities to make connections in a remote way. And that's a whole other conversation we could talk about. But I think it is opening up people to the idea that, listen, we can still be productive and get work done and weave in our other lives besides the professional one.
Susan, you're a mentor and a leader and a networker yourself in so many different ways. And I think that, you know, it's really important, no matter what's happening in our world, for women to also understand that you know, that there's so much possibility, both professionally and personally, that can come with having a really strong network to support you. Let's talk a bit about that and the importance of it. And, you know, for the next generation of women as leaders, you know, what is that going to mean, and what could that look like?
It's such a great question. And I was reflecting on this recently, you know, when I thought about my business school days, for example. We did have a women's group. At the time, I wasn't really engaged in it because there was such a pressure or feeling at that point in time to just fit in with the men and not call out the gender difference. And, you know, as I've gone on in my career, I've learned sort of the power of a community. So, like I said, starting with the Financial Women's Association, where I learned about the importance of making relationships in a professional capacity, because that was going to differentiate me when people got to know me beyond, you know, the output of the work, but what went into the work and the heart, the personality. That made a difference in how I showed up, how I led, how I got projects done, and so forth. And, you know, I wouldn't have necessarily have gotten that message as clear if we weren't having honest dialogues about that in a trusted environment. So I think that community and networks like Mayshad are very important to be able to have those conversations and ask other people, you know, what are you doing? Have you tackled this? Have you found this? How have you navigated? And I think this is how we can support each other, is by sharing our stories.
I love what you just said. And I think there's something really powerful about sharing our backstories as a part of that narrative process as well. You know, it's interesting that I think that women are very good at pivoting and reinventing and staying fresh and relevant and current, and figuring out ways to do that, right? Because that's just from the intuitive space that I think we all, whether we are conscious or unconscious of it, like that really does drive us, right? And I think it's also out of necessity, because we're also nurturers and caretakers. And so we're always, you know, for better or for worse, putting others first, right? But I also think that there's, you know, such a unique opportunity about using this as a time to really shift and change how we do support each other. and, keeping commitments to each other that it's okay when things aren't perfect. It's okay when we experience a loss. It's okay when, to make those things that we felt like we may have had to hide or hid before. Because how many times have we, even during the pandemic, have you, has someone said to you, "Oh, Susan, how are you doing?" Right? The natural response is, "Oh, I'm great," right? Like that's kind of the automatic response when we know right now that things are not great, right? We're all trying to find hope and to plan a future and to use this time to reflect and everything. But there's also this, I think there's a minute of, there's a danger in romanticizing too much about what's happening right now, because it is really also horrific, right? And being okay with understanding that things are not great, but using each other as a support system for whatever that is, professionally and personally. I think that now, and I'd love to get your thoughts on that, this is that, in women's networking in the past, it was often, structured in, from the, let's, get together and, be informed and educate and stay connected in that physical space, right? So we're always going to events or going to conferences or going to seminars or participating in workshops. We're supporting each other in more of the physical sense. But now we're not physical. And I think that also could possibly lend itself to much deeper conversations around how we can support each other. And tapping into some of those tough questions that women didn't feel comfortable with addressing each other in the past.
Yes. So I think it's about, how do you develop the relationships remotely? It's focusing in on what is it that we all have in common and bonding over that. I've been running some virtual programs with a local chamber of commerce, and part of that virtual programming is really not having it in webinar format, because we don't want it to be a one-way conversation. We want it to truly be a multi-way conversation. And when we've opened it up like that, we found people making connections, most recently, like on the spot in real time during the event. And they weren't even amongst the panelists. It was really amongst the audience themselves. So I think when you open up that community to say, let's have these dialogues, and it doesn't have to be perfect. Just be. And one of my mantras with women is just be you, because you do you very well. Nobody else does you better. So it's the same thing.
Susan, it's interesting. Excuse me, my allergies are so bad today.
Okay.
It's interesting what you just said. And I think that, so I'm going to throw a question back to you now.
Yeah.
So many of us are really questioning, what does it mean to be me right now, right? And so there was a very well-known woman in wealth management who said to me a couple of weeks ago, "I feel like I've lost my own identity because I no longer have my nanny. I don't have the housekeeper. I don't have the gardener. I don't have the people and the companies and consultants that I usually work face to face with and help me manage my life so that I can have my career. And I feel like I'm now lost. And so now I have to use this time to figure out who I really want to be when I grow up, right? Because we know that we're not going back to whatever was in the past. What recommendations do you have for other women? Because I think there are a lot of us right now that are really questioning, not just from the perspective of, what is my vision board, but just how do I manage now the chaos that is life?
Yes. It's such a real question. And for me, I think back to 2008 when it was the financial crisis and my position had been eliminated due to the economy. And I put so much of my identity into my profession. And so similar to your friend, I just had a moment where I was saying, well, I'm still a mother, I'm still a daughter, I'm still a sister, I'm still a wife, I'm still a community person. That wasn't taken away from me. So I think it's reconnecting with, what are the different roles that we play? And now what is in going back to really thinking about what's important to you? What are your values? What do you want to do with your time on this earth? And it's a great time of reflection. I'm not going to say that it's easy, and certain days are better than other days. Just thinking back to that particular time. But again, it's the support system and bouncing ideas off of people and just kind of putting yourself out there and being vulnerable. And it's okay. I think we get caught up sometimes in social media because we're seeing a lot of people's highlight reels, and they may not necessarily be sharing that this has been a really bad day, and look at my bad hair, and look at all these things, right? And I think to know that there's always a backstory going on, and to stay curious and to stay open to possibilities that might come your way. And to be open is also about reaching out to a community.
It's such a good point. So many really good points in what you just said. I think that there's also this moment in time where the professional and personal, the balance between life and work, like it's all just one big thing now, right? And so, companies that I think will come out much better on the other side of this can really take into consideration the fact that work now has to be even more flexible than maybe even what they were striving for in the past, in the sense of, to the point around, there are kids around, there are pets around, there are going to be, moments and times where you can't be available at within that 9 to 5 time period, just because life's not structured that way anymore. And there's also a lot of richness in just thinking through women's backstories and how now to use that to stay fresh and relevant and current in whatever you do next. Right? Even if you don't change in the sense of your career or your position or your kind of your goal trajectory, but still there's so much more personal narrative now that comes into your own personal brand, just because of the fact it has to, right? Because there really is no separation anymore. Which really blinds. I'm going to open it up to questions for the audience now. So please make sure to type in your questions and thoughts for us in the comments feed. We have one question that's a great here. A popular question I often get is, what do you do? So now in this moment in time, how do you go beyond your job title as a sense of your primary identity and include your full self so that you can authentically be yourself across all aspects of your life? And particularly in networking situations, Susan, because you're often asked, so my name is Jan and I am a blah, blah, blah. Or if I meet you, I'll say, oh, hi, Susan, what do you do? Right. And so kind of even from the macro level down to then how we articulate, our value to others when we're meeting them or greeting them or, whatever the case is. I think it is a really interesting question to ponder, particularly right now.
Yes. And I think it's okay to say, professionally, I do this, and personally, I'm a mom, a partner, a sister, a this, a that, a community person, whatever's, important to you, to share that you're much more than just a job title or description.
It's such a good idea to include the personal tidbit in there as well. And these are things obviously that you're as equally, if not even more passionate about, right? Like we're hopefully more passionate about, our children or our community life or whatever. I think it's interesting to say, this is what I do professionally, and I'm equally as passionate about blah, 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 blah. It's interesting.
I will tell you that a few years ago, I met somebody else named Susan Ganz. And she lives in a different town. She also went to the same business school, and we were brought together. She graduated a different year. But I learned from that Susan Ganz about the power of the personal. So she started, her first question to me was, so tell me about your family.
I love that. That's really, that really hits the nail on the head as in the sense of what our entire conversation is about today, right? It really opens up the holistic part of who you are as a person and how you really come together as that composite personality.
Yes.
All right, here's another great question from our audience. A popular networking strategy is to get over a popular networking strategy to get over feeling uncomfortable when walking into a room of strangers is to find the stragglers, people who also look as uncomfortable as you are, so you can jump into the conversation together. And how could this be replicated digitally? And this person who wrote this question is curious to know if this is a bad idea, considering that time is valued more. Like, how really, from a networking perspective, how should we be spending our time? Is it better to push toward networking with people you feel more comfortable with than to push yourself to meet people you might not feel comfortable with approaching? This is a great question.
Yes. I like a combination. It's not one size fits all. I think for me, where I've seen growth happens is when we go outside of our comfort zones, because then you're challenging yourself to get some different perspectives, to do something you haven't done before. You're going to activate a side of your brain that maybe you haven't before. And I think to be active too, challenge yourself to ask a question in the chat or to make a comment in the chat, because that's your way of being visible and showing up. And I think that's an important point too during this time that we are remote, is especially for women, to make sure you're being visible with the people that you are serving, whether it's a traditional job or an entrepreneurial job, that you're reaching out to your clients, you're reaching out to your leaders, and you're letting them know what is it that you're working on and what are you planning to work on and what are you doing, and that you're there in service to the company's mission.
It's such a good idea to participate in the chat, because I think we're all feeling a little Zoom fatigue now after being in this a couple months, and being really selective about how we show up and making sure that when we show up, we're fully present in showing up.
Yes.
Right. That we're not necessarily going wide, but we're really choosing how to go deep in those networks where we can find value either professionally or personally, and really using the chat. Because I always used to recommend, during the Q&A section, to make sure to ask a question, not because you're selling yourself, but because you want to have that visibility to the audience around you. And the chat's a perfect way to do that. And I think it's a very underutilized tool in Zoom. So great suggestion. Oh, another really good question. I love it. This is a great audience today. I love these questions. Is it more powerful to listen more or to talk more when you're in networking situations?
Oh, I love this question. To listen more. And so, as I forgot who made this up, but basically we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. And so that's a proportion to think about. So to listen more, because there's so much we learn when we're really intentional and really fully focused on what the other person is saying. I was just having a conversation the other day with somebody I was interviewing, and he shared that when a powerful moment in his life was when somebody just listened to him, just gave him this space to have a moment of sharing something very, very vulnerable, and the person didn't comment. They just were there to listen. And there's such power in that.
It's so true. I love that proportion. I never had thought about that before. That's great. That's a great rule to keep in mind. I'm wondering, to take this a step further too, I feel like, from a networking perspective, and you may as a master networker have experienced this too, where you feel sometimes you're being talked at instead of talked to, right? And so what do you do in those situations where, I think it's incredibly valuable to listen, but to also, how should I say this? I employ a rule that I want to be around people who make me feel good. And I think you had said this in the early part of the conversation, to really listen to your intuition to help you understand, at the end of a conversation, ask yourself, how did this person make me feel? Right. And to use that as, a filter in the sense of who do you really want to have in the different buckets of your networking life. But wondering in those situations where you start to get the feeling like listening, it's not necessarily about listening, like they're not choosing you to tell your story, to tell their story to, because they'll tell the same story to 100 different people in the room, right? Or 100 different conversations. How can you assess that? And then what are some recommendations to move beyond that, to make sure, number one, that you're also getting airtime with them, and number two, that you're actually communicating with a human being and not just communicating to a wall or with a wall, I should say.
So the phrase "trust your gut" comes to mind because our guts, which really mean our intuition, that's where we innately feel things. So trust that. So if as the person's talking, you're getting your sense is that this person's just about them, and you just happen to physically be there as a container for that conversation, you can politely exit the conversation. It's like, I'm sure you want to meet other people, whether it's in the chat or somewhere else. Let's, wonderful to meet you, and just sort of exit that conversation. You don't have to be beholden to them. It should be a natural kind of give and take. And you'll be able to suss it out, and you'll be able to suss it out in their behavior too. I was in a recent situation where somebody did a post about a meeting we were in, and I thought that was great. I commented, and then I messaged that person. I said, oh, we should have a one-on-one, and then the true kind of personality came in, where that person did not follow up on the one-on-one, just remained silent and just kind of liked the comments. So that was a clue about, okay, that's more about that person and not about collaborating.
It's a really good tip, and I think that now we're all digital and virtual for at least the foreseeable near future. It's even easier to walk away gracefully from some of those conversations that don't make you feel fulfilled.
Yes.
So, in follow up to the question about is it more powerful to listen than to talk? Which, Susan, do you feel is more important, the introduction or the follow up? Which actually goes to what you were just saying about the follow up.
So I think the introduction is your first impression. And then I think the follow-up is how you show your character. And I've fallen down sometimes on follow-ups because life has gotten in the way. And so being real. But it is the ongoing engagement where people see your personality. And I think if you show consistency, people really understand and then get curious. Like this morning I was talking to somebody from our chamber about an event. I was curious. I hadn't seen her in a while. What's going on? And then she shared all these different things that are going on in her life. So don't make assumptions. Ask. Get really curious.
It's such a good point. And I think that there's also a moment in time now where where we're valuing patience is particularly important, and empathy, because we don't know, to your point, we don't know what else is happening in someone else's world and someone else's life right now. We don't know how they've been impacted by the pandemic, either from a health perspective, from a financial perspective, like whatever that is, right? And understanding too, like we're all shifting now suddenly into the world of all things related to technology and digital. And that in and of itself is not easy. Right. And I think that we're all consuming and engaging content very differently. And that's changing week by week, right? In the sense of what content is interesting in what moment in time, given what else is happening in the world, right? And how are we also practicing self-care where we can't necessarily be present for everyone, and maybe in the same way that we felt like we had to be and were effectively in the past. One thing also that's come up in large part in the sense of, how we network and how we are seen and how we're visible is, the cancellation of all the conferences for the rest of the year, right? And so for many of us, that represented a tremendous loss of income from speaking engagements, or a loss of potential revenue because our companies would sponsor or, have a booth or whatever that is. And now for those companies that are moving conferences virtually, there's still kind of the same networking effect where you go and you absorb the content and you learn, and hopefully that positively impacts your business or your position or your outlook or just your your values as a human being. But then now we're looking at not just 5,000 people or 1,000 people in a room across a few days. We're looking at all these faces right on a screen.
Yeah.
And so we talked about how do you stand out in a Zoom chat with maybe 30 or 40 people, but how can you stand out in just kind of the sea of mass enormousness that is now the conference world as it is on digital, not knowing when we'll be able to go to Web Summit again all together in Portugal, or to attend South by Southwest again, or whatever conferences are greatly significant to our own industries.
So I think a way to connect is they often publish who's going to be speaking, and if you have an interest in engaging with that person, it's about being proactive and connecting with them on LinkedIn, for example, and writing them a note. I see you're speaking at, I'm really interested in XYZ, would love to connect. And I think that's a differentiator. You can differentiate yourself too in making posts on LinkedIn in terms of, writing an article or thought leadership, or I'm very excited for this upcoming conference where they're going to discuss this, and you could tag the conference. So there are so many different ways that are for free that we can make a difference and be seen and be visible. Again, it's about being visible.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Such a good point. And I think that now is an opportunity to, engage in social media, maybe not in the same way that we did in the past, because how many of us would have tagged or posted or used hashtags or, done the research in advance of attending the conference, right? Because life always gets in the way. But now is a great moment in time to be a much better strategic planner around how we show up, right? To the points of our conversation earlier.
Absolutely.
Susan, thank you so much for being with us here today. Would love to have you back as we move forward through to creating the new future together. Susan Ganz, everyone. Susan, how can we stay in touch with you?
That's wonderful. Thanks for asking. So you can find me on ganzstrategicsolutions.com. It's GANZ. You can connect with me on LinkedIn under Susan Ganz, GANZ, of Ganz Strategic Solutions. And I'm happy to share some materials with folks when they reach out as they think through how to be thriving in this pandemic.
Thank you again, Susan. It's such a fun conversation. Oh, Susan, tell us, what is the word that you use that we were trying to pronounce before around how we want to move to this new world of engaging yet informative and fun content?
Yes. So I call it edutainment. So it's education and entertainment.
I love this because I think right now we all want to be able to laugh and learn simultaneously. Thank you again, Susan, and everyone out there. Thank you so much for tuning in with us each and every Thursday at 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time for our Women in Money series. Please make sure to join us Thursdays at the end of the day at 5 o'clock as Paula Jennings closes out the week for us on our Mayshad Women in the City series, where we bring a cocktail or a beverage of choice and just all hang out together on Zoom. And every Monday, we kick off the week with Dr. Risa Reiger, one of our investors and clinical psychologists, as she helps help us to stay grounded and sane during this crazy moment in time. We have a lot of fun with Risa as well. And on Tuesdays, we have our diversity, equity, and inclusion series at 4 p.m. and Workshop Wednesdays, where we host workshops for our members. You can learn more about membership by joining us at joinmayshad.com, join Mayshad, MAYSHAD.com. Again, I'm Jan Mercer-Doms, the Vice President of U.S. Development for Mayshad Choice. Thank you, everyone. See you soon.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. Bye, everyone. David.